Zibby here, and I've got Rotus with me this beautiful morning to have this conversation about, well, debt servicing in Nigeria. Would love you to be a part of the conversation, so let us know what your thoughts are. The WhatsApp number is 0809 440 981, or just tweet at smooth981. And don't forget the hashtag, it's hashtag Business Express 981. Good morning, Rotus.
Good morning, Zibby. Good morning to all our listeners and viewers. Good to be with you all again. On a Thursday, the weekend is almost here. Can't be happier.
You know what? I don't know. There was a time I used to be happy about weekends, but these days it just seems like weekends are like any other day for some reason.
Zibby, at this point, I can take any day I get, even if it's one day or half a day. Let me rest. I spent all night looking up this budget breakdown, and I'm just exhausted. So let's jump in. But yeah, I appreciate any day you can get. Just take it like that.
Okay, all right. So we're talking about debt servicing and the minister's statement that the federal government had basically used 80.6% of its revenue in service of debts.
Yeah, so we got a budget breakdown in Abuja yesterday. 21 trillion naira budget is what is being put forward for 2023. If you convert that 21 trillion at 461 naira per dollar, as at the official exchange rate, that's about $45 billion or so. If you convert it at the parallel market rate at about 740, it's about $28 billion. So anyway, from 28 to $45 billion. Is that enough for a nation of 200 million people? That is the question. I would say no, but that's just where we are. But she was in Abuja along with Ben Akabweze, the Director General of the Budget Office, and they gave a full breakdown of the budget. So essentially, this is 2023, or the 80% figure that you're quoting there. That is the budget performance for 2022. So that's one of the things we look forward to when they come and put forward the budget for the new year. They also give us the performance of the budget for the prior year. So they gave us numbers for January through November of 2022 to tell us how well that budget, I think that budget was 17 trillion or so. So basically, as far as the revenues that we brought in last year, between January and November, Nigeria's revenues was 6.5 trillion naira. That's how much we brought in terms of, money. Now, out of that 6.5, Nigeria spent 5.2 trillion on debt servicing. That is paying interest on debt. And so 5.2 trillion as a percentage of 6.5 trillion is 80%. That is 80 naira out of every 100 naira that Nigeria brought in revenues went towards servicing debts. Think about that. Think about 80%. Wow. Think about 80% of your salary.
Right.
Goes paying somebody who you owe money. Oh, man.
Wow, that's a shocking figure, really.
Listen.
Wow. Okay, let's come to the 2023 budget. What other relevant figures are there?
Yeah, for 2023, so 21 trillion naira is the full expenditure. The federal government is projecting about 10.7 of that to be revenues. So you got to put that within the context of the number we just got for 2022. So for 2022, January through November, there was 6.5 trillion we brought in revenues. Now, I have to say, though, that out of that 6.5 trillion, I think about 586 billion was the government's share of oil revenues. So we underperformed massively. I mean, it was only just that 37 or 35% of what we projected to bring in for oil revenues is what we got. The rest, all the other money came from non-oil revenues, company income tax, value-added tax. So non-oil revenues really helped us out. But for a country that depends so much on oil, that's, I guess, a good thing. But in terms of our exports, we're still not exporting the money, the FX revenue we get is still wholly dependent on oil. But that aside, 6.5 trillion was what we brought in for 2022. We're projecting 10.7 trillion. So you brought in 6.5 trillion in 2022. You are projecting to bring in 10 trillion in 2023. How are you going to do it? That's one. Another relevant figure is the deficits, the difference between revenues and expenditure and revenue. So I think the deficit for 2022 was about 6.3 trillion. Our projected deficit for 2023 is about 10 trillion. So our deficit is almost equal to our revenues for 2023. And I mean, those are the three big numbers: the expenditure, your revenues, and your deficit. Now, the deficit, of course, how do you plan to fund it? That is the question.
Okay. And I want to talk about the minister having a moment acknowledging female journalists. Can we just speak about that a bit?
It warmed my heart. Zibby, in our profession, we're referred to as journalists. And whenever there's a gathering of journalists, for whether it's a press release or something, they address them. And the authority, the people who are, whether it's a private sector or public sector, when the gathering of journalists gets in front of you, they'll say, welcome, gentlemen of the press. It drives me crazy. So if you and I attend a press release, they will say to Zibby and Rotus, "Oh, gentlemen of the press, you're welcome." So she had
basically.
She had this great moment before she read the budget, which I just love. She was like, "Oh, I also want to say welcome to ladies and gentlemen of the press. I understand for some reason we keep saying gentlemen of the press. We're still querying that." I thought it was, oh man, I thought it was just, I wanted to clap when she said that. So it was just really a great moment of her using her platform and her power to address this thing that just doesn't make any sense. And just for any government people that are listening or private sector people, if you don't know what to say, just say members of the press. Just keep it simple. Just say members of the press or ladies and gentlemen of the press. Anyway, so I had to highlight that because I thought that was awesome. That was her addressing that.
All right. And coming back to the budget, so I want to ask this though: what is the impact of spending 80% of revenue on servicing debts?
Yeah, so the impact is you don't have enough money for capital expenditure. Our capital expenditure, in fact, by the way, 2022, I think recurrent expenditure was about 8 trillion. I have to go and look at the numbers again. So that's money you're spending on salaries and so on and so forth. Personnel costs was about almost 4 trillion naira, I think, if I remember correctly. But when you're spending so much money on your debts, you do not have enough money to spend on building roads and bridges and things that will impact the public. So I think the capital expenditure for 2022 massively underperformed. It was like 60% under its target. So when so much money is, so think about it, if 80% of your salary is going to pay off somebody that you owe money, that's 20% left to save money. And so that's the impact, and it's very troubling.
Okay, Rotus, I want to talk about debts and deficit. These are terms that come up every now and then. Most people, of course, know the difference, but from your perspective, could you just break it down?
Yeah. So very simple. Your deficit is the difference between your revenues and your expenditure. If your expenditure exceeds your revenues. So for example, 2022, we brought in 6.5 trillion in what's it called? 6.5 trillion in revenues, but the expenditure was, I think, about 13 or 14 trillion or so. So that's for 2022. So we ended the difference between your expenditure and your revenues. If your expenditure exceeds your revenues, you have a deficit. If your revenues exceed your expenditure, you have a surplus. That is, if the money you are bringing in as revenue is less than the money you are spending, then what you are spending exceeds what you are bringing in, you have a deficit. If the money you are bringing in is more than the money you are spending, and you have a surplus, that's basically different. Now, your debt, of course, is money that you owe. Hence, that's your debt servicing, which is why you end up spending, basically money you owe. So deficit is the difference between expenditures. When expenditures exceed revenues, your debt is money that you owe. That's basically the difference between the two. And Nigeria hasn't had a budget surplus in, I can't remember, it's been years since that happened. You know, pretty ugly.
Let's talk about the budget. So what are the projections? What's the deficit figure projected for this budget that the president has just signed?
This deficit is 10.7 trillion. So it's a massive amount. The deficit is almost as much as the projected revenues. And the interesting thing is that we usually underperform revenues. So we never meet the target of the money we want to bring in. But for expenditure, we overperform and spend more than the money we projected that we're going to spend. So that's the deficit we're looking at, about 10.7 trillion naira.
All right. This is Business Express. You're listening to the conversation right here on Smooth 98.1. If you want to be a part of the conversation, you've got a message or a comment, really, just send it through 0809 4440981 on WhatsApp or tweet at Smooth981. Rotus, I want to ask, fuel subsidies, we can't stop talking about them. What role do they play in this budget?
Yeah, so they allocated some money to fuel subsidies, but they only allocated enough money up until June. I remember they are leaving office in May, so after that, it's not their problem. They are just leaving it for the next person to handle. So they projected only 3.3 trillion naira to June. If it turns out that they don't remove subsidies next year and they keep it, then that 3.3 trillion now becomes 6 trillion naira. So that second half of the year is not accounted for. So that's an extra 3 trillion that has to be found to pay for fuel subsidies if they don't remove it by June. That's for the new administration. And imagine you're just coming into office in May, you now want to remove. So anyway, next year will be interesting.
It will be. It will be. Speaking about fuel subsidies, though, you made observations of things going on in Bayelsa. What exactly happened?
It's similar to what we see in Lagos. People were queuing up. There have been lines in Bayelsa. There's been no fuel scarcity there. People there were saying that they were lining up at fuel stations where they were selling at 165, 170. Bayelsa, this fuel that's being sold there in other places is as high as 350, 400, 500 naira per liter.
Wow.
But the people there, this is the key thing. The people were saying that we don't want to go and buy at 400-500, so we're going to line up at the 170, despite how many years of us saying that is not the realistic price and you need to remove fuel subsidies. So if you remove fuel subsidies, that 500, 400 naira price is what more people will be looking at. Exactly. And then what's the impact? What's the reaction to governments? It's a really touchy, it's a hot potato that has to be addressed next year. Oh, sorry, this year. We're already here. It's this year.
Wow. So do you think these subsidies are actually going to be removed this year?
Zibby, I want subsidies removed. I support them being removed because we don't have the money to pay to afford them. But that 400, 500 naira per liter for people that own SUVs, for not even for those ones that are the wealthier people, for the ordinary man and woman on the streets, transportation costs, inflation, it's really touchy. Whoever comes into office just has to be really bold. They have to take on the backlash of higher costs. So they have to find a way to do something. Just what to answer, I'm not even answering your question. I hope so. I hope it's removed, but the reaction is going to be tough.
It will be. We're almost out of time, but I've got a final question. Is it a possibility that Nigeria could possibly seek IMF support? If
down the road that we're going, it is a possibility. I mean, they've said no, it's not going to happen, but Ghana has said no, and Ghana approached the IMF. If Nigeria's debt continues to eat up 80% of our revenues, then where else will you go? You have to borrow more money, and if you can't borrow any more because your profile is downgraded by ratings agencies and debt is more expensive in the capital markets, then you might have no choice but to go to the IMF.
All right, I've got a few comments coming through. This one is from Benga. He says, it's now gentlemen and gentlewomen of the press. No, Benga, it's ladies and gentlemen of the press. And the last budget, how much of it was implemented and how many people did that budget lift out of poverty?
Great question.
All right, Benga, I see your message. Unfortunately, we have limited time on the show, so the messages need to come in earlier, but thank you for being a part of the show. Thank you so much, Rotus, for being a part.
Thank you, Zibby. Tomorrow is Tech Friday. I'll catch you guys. We'll talk some tech.
Alrighty, do stay with us. There's a lot more to come on Smooth Breakfast.
Beyond the headlines. Business Express.